I'm Andrea Learned, and welcome to Living Change, a podcast exploring unconventional climate leadership. I talk to people who've converted their personal values into business and policy decisions in a load of different sectors. I believe that the more we're visible about these changes, the more we chart the way for other leaders wanting to create new social norms. In this special episode of Living Change, climate journalist and podcaster Amy Westervelt and I discuss her new podcast series, Light, Sweet, Crude. A crossover of her award-winning podcast, Drilled, Amy dives deep into ExxonMobil's activities in Guyana, debunking the moral case for fossil fuels. As a longtime climate journalist, she has a 30,000-foot view of what's going on. We get into the lessons learned from watching bad corporate influence. Things like the importance of local reporting and big picture narrative framing, something the good guys are just not as good at. We even had a light bulb moment over a new role corporations should consider.
Hi.
Hey.
How's it going?
Good. It's great to meet you.
I was like, I've interacted with her on social media before, but we've never talked.
Yeah, this is the thing. And I don't know how long. I think it was, this is the thing that I actually want to talk about a little bit is climate media on Twitter.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about not the where it is right now, but just that's how I found you. That's how we started to engage. Yeah. How is climate media feeling about Twitter right now? And tell me why you do use it a lot and why you have.
Yeah. I feel conflicted about Twitter right now, just because of all of the stuff that's been happening there. And then there has been a huge uptick in trolls and a lot of kind of climate denial bots. There's this one bot that just posts NOAA data at every climate tweet, which
nice.
Yeah. But anyway, so that, and also I'm finding that I'm not seeing as much of the people that I actually follow in my feed. So it's harder to keep track of what's going on with different climate things unless I'm just going to specific people's profiles and looking at what they've been saying. It's weird. So I have a Mastodon account now too. And there's some interesting stuff happening over there as well. And I've been just spending a lot less time on Twitter, which is great for getting actual work done. So that's good.
Who knew?
I know.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm really glad that I've been following you for a while and that we've engaged a little bit because it's super exciting to watch your work. And
thank you.
This new show is really, there's only 2 episodes up so far.
Yeah.
And it's been amazing. But the thing that I noted just kind of leading in with social media is the second episode, talking with the publisher, Glenn.
Yes.
Right. And so, I mean, I could just jump right in, but the deal is that he is just right. He's on this and he's on this and this. So tell me a little bit about when, that's a big deal that this guy is fully trying to use it. So tell me about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And actually, I think I might put this out as a bonus episode because I had a long conversation with him about sort of the parameters of that as a publisher and how much you should and shouldn't be trying to influence, public opinion about things or politics or whatever. And he kind of sees himself as a publisher as he's I'm not a journalist, I'm a publisher, so it's different, but also I'm also a citizen of this country, so I should be allowed to have opinions about how the country is being run and things like that. But anyway, it was interesting, but he is very really out there on social media, making videos on TikTok and he's on YouTube and he's doing stuff all the time. He has a newspaper and a radio station, and he likes to, his main thing is to translate the news into local dialect, which they call Creolese.
Yes.
As a way to speak to predominantly the working class population there. So it's pretty interesting how he uses it. I mean, he's gotten really into TikTok. He's making a video a day. He's got a green screen. He's really elaborate sets. And,
isn't he just using it like a verb too? I TikToked or I ticked or I'm TikToking
you again today. He's very entertaining.
I thought it was so cool, but it kind of gets right into kind of the influence that you're talking about, the influence of Exxon there, which is, and we can get deeper into it, right? Which is advertorials and all the stuff that we're going to talk about. And he's just like, how can I even, come up with balancing that? And so I guess the question there would be, how into listening to social media or following TikTok or whatever are the people? So tell me about the balance. Obviously, it's hugely out of proportion, but what's the balance of people that are paying attention to him versus reading advertorials or whatever?
Actually, I think he's having a lot of influence. And I say that because the things that Exxon starts to do marketing videos on are often the things that he's like getting people riled up about.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
So interesting. So he's been talking about this contract thing there for a long time where he's like, it's not really 50-50 because they are paying themselves back for expenses before anything gets split and all of this stuff. Like, he's really been hammering on the point that this contract that Exxon has with the government of Guyana is not fair to Guyana and that they're never going to make any money off of it and all that stuff. And so Exxon just put up a bunch of billboards all around Georgetown being like 50-50, it's a fair deal, And I'm like, wow, Glenn's getting to him.
They're using his phrasing and you know what? That he's got a lot of influence. That's huge, isn't it?
Yeah. It's really big. So, I mean, he's really, I do think, and of course, like, people criticize him too. They're like, oh, he's just mad because he's not getting rich off of the oil, or, he doesn't understand like what it took for Exxon to, get this going. And, it's perfectly fair that they pay themselves back some expenses and all of that kind of stuff too. But he's definitely having an influence, and he's not afraid to like be very public. So
that's incredible. So the episode, The Contract, is the second episode of Light, Sweet, Crude, and it's incredible. And so can you give a short synopsis of what that is for us today?
Yes. So Exxon in 1999 actually inked a contract with Guyana. And at that point, it was Exxon in partnership with Shell. And they, got an agreement in place to do some exploratory drilling off the shore of Guyana and like around the coast and land and stuff too. But they didn't really do much because they were both in Venezuela at the time and other parts of South America where it was a lot easier to get at the oil. And nobody knew quite what the deal was in Guyana. But then in 2008, Exxon started exploring in earnest offshore, still wasn't really finding much. Shell pieced out. And in 2015, Exxon announced we found a lot of oil. We think there's a considerable amount of oil here, and started drilling. So they inked a new contract in 2016. And that's the contract that's in place now. And theoretically, it's a 50-50 profit share between the oil companies and the country, the government of Guyana. But the way that it's been structured is that the oil companies can take 75% off the top to pay themselves back for various costs. And those costs continue to grow as they look for more and more oil offshore and drill more wells. So the tab just kind of keeps getting bigger.
And the people of Guyana will not get anything, it seems like, right?
That's what a lot of financial analysts have said. Now, what they're doing about that, and this is maybe a little bit of a spoiler, but it's going to be in the news soon too. So, in April, the government of Guyana is going to have a big auction, and they are going to auction off oil blocks to various other companies. Exxon has bought in to be able to be a bidder as well. So they might end up, doing another contract with Exxon on those blocks, or they might end up doing a contract with Chevron, which is one of the companies that's interested. Shell, there's a lot of companies that have paid. There's a fee you have to pay to get access to the seismic data and whatnot to put a bid in. So what Guyana has said is basically, look, there's no way we're going to be able to renegotiate this contract. you know, if Exxon wanted to renegotiate, it would only be like to try to make it more beneficial to themselves. Like they're a company. They're not going to be like, yeah, let's sit down and, make this pencil out worse for us,
Right.
So the government has said, well, we'll just open it up to other companies because if we can get a couple of contracts in place that are more lucrative to us, then that kind of gets everyone off our back about not getting enough money in off on this Exxon deal.
Right. So,
which is very interesting. Yeah.
Very interesting to see what happens with that. The other interesting thing right now that this show is just coming out is the IPCC report.
That's right.
So it's just like every story. It's like the indignation you can't even, that isn't enough.
I know. Yeah. So yeah, the IPCC has once again said there cannot be any more new fossil fuel developments. They've been saying it, and it's a really complicated issue because this is why actually we wanted to do this season on Guyana,
totally,
because it's a really good example of what's going on kind of in the world right now. For the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of global South country leaders have been saying like, well, if you don't want us to drill for oil, then we need money from somewhere else to be able to adapt to climate change, transition to renewables, all of this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And have been saying, rightly so, like, how dare the global north tell us not to develop our fossil fuel resources when you guys did it for, 100 years or more, right?
Right.
And so, it's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The problem is the global climate system is the global climate system. And in many cases, we're talking about countries that will be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this really like kind of ridiculous situation where because the global north has not come through on commitments that they've made to pay for climate adaptation and to pay climate reparations and to actually help the global south transition, they are in the position of having to pay for climate adaptation by developing fossil fuels, which doesn't make any sense at all.
Right.
So that's very much kind of the predicament for Guyana. 90% of Guyana's population lives on the coast. 90%.
Wow.
It will be underwater by 2030.
I mean, that's pretty soon.
That's very soon. It's the first year that analysts are saying like could possibly be when they like start to get more oil money in.
Oh.
Just for context.
Wow.
So it's really, so as we kind of, build through the season, we're really looking at like, okay, what are the trade-offs that are being made here? What are the climate implications of this? How do we evaluate this idea that fossil fuels drive development and are necessary to end poverty and all of this stuff? Because it's a very entrenched narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, if you look at the economics data from 1980 onward, none of the global South countries that got into oil have wound up better off. It's like, like maybe you have a little bit of a spike and maybe even on paper, it looks like, oh, the GDP has gone up. But if you look at per capita wealth, no. If you look at things like education or even access to energy, because that's another big thing that the industry is like, oh, well, we need to get poor people fossil fuels, right?
They can claim it's that. Yeah.
Yeah, they claim that. Nigeria, which, has been in the oil business for a really long time, is last in the world on energy access. So I'm like, if you're going to make that argument, like you might want to invest in like actually getting the energy to people so that they feel like they are getting something out of it, because right now, like global oil majors get rich and that's pretty much it, you know? So yeah, it's really like, it reminds me of what happened with cigarettes and now actually with combustion engine automobiles, where like, as the US and Europe and other, northern countries start to pass regulation on these things, companies just shift the market elsewhere. It's happening with plastic too. It's like, it gets dumped on the global south. And then, there's all of this sort of rhetorical gymnastics done to convince people in the global south that it's a gift. I call it, I told something the other day, I feel like fossil fuels are the pox infested blanket of today. It's really not. Yeah.
What you were talking about, the social kind of the influence, what was the term that you used? It's just like they're supporting the cricket team and making it a big,
yeah.
I want, this
building
is fascinating. Yes, building social license.
Yeah.
Let's dig in on that. Oh my goodness.
It's so interesting. So yeah, they do this in like the US and all over the world too, oil companies in general. So, like Shell is the sponsor of Jazz Fest in New Orleans.
Right. Oh my
right?
God.
They sponsor like a bunch of different museums everywhere, aquariums. They love to do aquarium exhibits that show like
family
how great offshore platforms are for like sea life. Yes. It's like, look, it provides something for coral to grow on. And
oh my goodness. Oh, that term that just really got to me. Because it's the greenwashing. And just to bring it back kind of to what I work on, which is trying to do the opposite, right? So are there ways that this influence, so in the corporate sustainability world, say there's a lot of advising, start to write op-eds, start to whatever, right? So one of the bigger topics I had for you was, you now know what all this influence is doing kind of negatively. Have you seen like, well, shoot, if corporate leaders would just take these two tools and leverage them better, we could maybe counter this. Have you seen anything like that you could point out?
That's a good question. I don't know. The problem is often that the industry has been doing it for so long and so broadly. So it's like, it's not just an op-ed. It's like at the same time, they'll have, a program running in K-12 schools.
Right.
The Jazz Fest sponsorship and a bunch of museums, lobbying on Capitol Hill, lobbying at the state level, lobbying at the local level, and like a weekly op-ed. And their CEO is like going on all of the cable shows and like, framing the narrative.
They're so far ahead and their money is so in all these areas before that anyone who's kind of starting to think about doing it on the positive side, it's just like a huge mountain. They don't think they could ever climb it.
It is, but I do think that there's like a couple things. Well, and also I think it's important to remember too that they've been doing this for like over 100 years. That's why they're so good at it. They were like the early beta testers of like market research and polling and all of that kind of stuff too, they've been that was like in the early 1900s already. Standard Oil of New Jersey was doing like market surveys and really drilling down into, and getting really, really specific about like who like would which messages would resonate with which audiences and all of that kind of stuff. So like, I think number one, like, don't beat yourself up for not being able to immediately counteract that because it's a lot,
Thank you. Yes. Number one.
Yeah.
Well, number one, don't think it's over already.
Exactly.
Right. I think that's a good point to make. Okay. So what's number two?
I actually think that people need to invest more time and money into like thinking through narrative framing. And that sounds really wonky and like abstract, but I like, this is the thing that I think the industry does so well. And like, is decide like what framing best like most benefits them. And then they figure out, okay, what are all the ways that we're going to seed this? Mm-hmm. What I see corporate sustainability people doing and like people in the climate movement doing a lot is like starting with the particular tool and then like
figuring it out.
Yeah. Versus like, okay, how do we want to change people's minds? And then like, what are the things that could actually get us there?
Well, at a very, very small scale, one of the things that I see is literally people will call me for advice and be like, okay, we want to get on the cover of whatever. And I'm like, has anyone heard from your CEO for the last 5 years on this topic? No. Right. So it's building social capital and also to your point, like this narrative thing is really interesting. Have you seen some of the publicity, just as an aside, have you seen some of the publicity lately about kind of Hollywood and changing storytelling in Hollywood? Have you seen any of that?
Yes. Which I think is really important. And I feel like there again, there's this huge moment, right, in Hollywood right now where like there's like people are more interested. There's money being thrown at these things. Like, Don't Look Up did really well, and that helped to unlock a lot of interest in these things.
Yeah.
But there's huge potential for very problematic narratives to get baked in, because in a lot of cases, like even to the extent that, I know there's projects like the Good Energy Project, and there's another one called Climate Spring that's in the UK that are doing great work on trying to connect, screenwriters and directors with climate experts.
Yeah.
But climate is one of those things where I think a lot of people think they have a grasp on it. And it's so much bigger than what most people really necessarily know. And especially like, there's not everyone can have like 20 years worth of history on what's been going on in their head, So like, for example, someone told me the other day that they got pitched a story from this screenwriter, and it was like a rom-com and this and that. And it's like, she's like, yeah, I was reading it and I was like, this is so great. And then one of the plot things in it was like that these were two climate scientists and they were going to an international climate summit, and that one of them wanted to like fudge the numbers so that people would understand how urgent the issue was. Right. And I was like, this is literally ClimateGate. And like, yeah. So she was like, oh no, like, so she was able to tell this guy like, okay, let me sit you down and tell you about this thing that happened and why this is like problematic. And he was like, oh, I had no idea. But of course you wouldn't. 'Cause like, that's such a tiny thing to know about, So, yeah.
And how would they? So if there are whole bodies, and so this sector heading in that direction is fantastic. We're all for it. And there are these organizations that are trying to help, but what would you even recommend, or what would help them do it? Like, I feel like if everyone just read Climate Journalist and listened to your podcast, it sure would help. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I agree. No,
of course you do.
No, I really think, it's the same thing that I think we need in mainstream media across the board. Is like, there need to be people like with some amount of authority in the writer's room or in the production company or whatever that actually know what they're talking about. Like, I actually don't think it's something that can be solved by like just bringing in a consultant for a few hours.
Okay, great. Yes.
I feel like, I don't know, like I almost wonder if like there needs to be like a few companies that like just specialize in that, and like they partner with lots of bigger companies or something. Because
so would there be the chief climate science storytelling person? Like, so corporations have a chief sustainability officer, right? But so it's almost like, yeah, I so agree that you have to, like, you have to. You have to have someone on staff doing that. It's almost like the intimacy coordinator. Right now there's an intimacy coordinator on these sets. Hello to having some sort of a climate
science.
That's so
interesting. You're right. I hadn't thought about that. But yes, exactly. Like something like that.
You're doing intimacy wrong, and we've got to change things. And so that's what climate is, right?
Yes. Yes. That's a great parallel, because it's similarly like kind of niche, but also huge,
But like, also huge with the impact. I mean, I've been watching that Hollywood space, and I interviewed somebody earlier in the season on that, and I'm just going, this is amazing. And the influence. So what I talk about a lot in my work is climate influence, right? And living change is this podcast. But so influence, right? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the greenwash and the negative. So what are these large bodies of sectors that have some major influence potentially, and how can we help trigger that? So Hollywood, corporations, like get people to really, and let's talk a little bit about pledges versus acting over and over again.
Right. Because, well, I think it is tough for corporations right now, because I feel like there's this whole system that's been created that like rewards companies for marketing. Right.
Yes,
I mean, literally, like that's what it's like. There's so many of these like CSR awards that just go off of like your CSR report, which could theoretically just be marketing. There's so many companies that have their chief sustainability officer is in the marketing department, right? Like they're not in operations, they're not in, so like I think that thinking about it in a way that is different from the way corporations that are really just trying to hide emissions have done it is like a really good start. Like, I actually think that the companies that are serious about it need to kind of like chuck out what's been done before and think about like,
Yes.
what are we
Hallelujah.
actually trying to do? And like, you know, like not what are we trying to market or what are we like trying to promote, but like, what are we actually trying to do? And then figure out the marketing piece around it, you know, versus for the most part, it's often like the marketing first and then figuring out the nuts and bolts later. And like, you know, I think that's not great because actually like, companies, especially when companies within the same industry can come together and sort of like
Yes.
consolidate some of that power and influence, they can really move the needle a lot, you know?
My argument would also be that we need a couple first movers. Like we need like one or two. And one of the things that I look
Yes.
at is what we're actually looking
Yeah.
for is a perceived shift in social norm of leadership. We don't need the shift to actually be scientific. We need it to look as if the ball is already rolling.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. And with regard to your work and the greenwashing, right? So it's greenwashing, make that sucker so irrelevant that those companies look like buffoons because all the cool companies, whether they have money or not, are coming out and being smarter about TikToks or whatever it is. We have a couple leaders that step out and do something different and take bolder steps. So there's so much power in this influence. And we'll pause there because I could just go on, but there's a real opportunity. So let's go back to Light Sweet Crude and talk about your role as a climate media person. And the beginning of the first episode is, my hotel room was canceled again. Right? Talk about that a little. Scary.
Yes. And actually, like, we cut some stuff out of that episode because my lawyer was like, like I feel a little bit, you know.
Okay,
but it's just like Exxon in particular, oil companies in general are not super like friendly to journalists. And, you know, we see proof of this all the time. And Exxon in particular has kind of a reputation for like trying to intimidate journalists. So like, I interviewed this guy in the first episode, Steve Call, who wrote an excellent book called Private Empire about the way that Exxon operates like around the world. And he said, he was like, I covered Al-Qaeda, I covered the CIA, and like Exxon was by far the scariest and the most intimidating and like hard to cover.
I mean, when I listened to that, I was like, you know, I almost had to stop because you're right. He makes such an incredible point.
I know. I was like, oh, but he's like, you know, like they do these things to try to intimidate people and they're very good at it. And, you know, and they're very powerful. I think that like he did a great job in that book of really showing how like these global companies in many ways are more powerful than any one government, right? Because they have so much influence across multiple governments that they kind of operate like above the laws of any one government. And that can make them a little, you know, scary to cover.
A little bit. And that's your work is digging in on that and this investigative reporting style. So how did you in your career get brave enough to go, you know what? I'm going to super dig in.
I'm going to do it anyway. I think I just have like a thick skin about that stuff. Like I don't know. I feel like I just kind of, I'm not a big rule follower. And
all right.
When someone tells me no, I'm kind of like, are you sure? Because I feel like I could. So yeah, I think that's partly it. And also I have like a really like, I don't know, overdeveloped sense of sort of like righteous indignation. I'm like very like, you know, into underdog movies and all of that kind of stuff. And I feel like for me, I'm like on climate, I kind of feel like most of us are the underdog. And there's this, you know, group of very powerful people that have been able to do things mostly because we don't know about them or, you know, we don't have or we don't think we have the power to
Mm-hmm.
stop them. But I think that the more that people know and understand, the more, I don't know, like the better armed they are to actually like show up to the fight. And like that feels important to me. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that you mention, and then you dig in and you're speaking with this reporter, Kayana.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm always interested in climate reporting, and especially these big stories that are far off, right? You really rely on some locals on the ground. She's incredible, but I'm certain you've run across those people.
She's really incredible.
Tell us a little bit about local reporting, her in specific, and just broadly in all of your work, how important that is and what it makes a difference about.
It's huge. So her name's Kiana Wilberg. She's a reporter in Guyana. She's from there. She's been on the oil and gas beat for the last 5 or 6 years. And initially, I met her because we were looking to hire someone on the ground in Guyana. And purely coincidentally, my producer on the show had a professor at university who was from Guyana.
No way.
Yes, who was a professor at the university there for a while. And so she asked him, like, just on the off chance, hey, do you know anyone that's an oil and gas reporter? And he recommended Kiana. And that's how we met her.
Wow.
And she's incredible. She's really young, but like so good and like so determined to do a good job. And she has this real, like, she's quite religious too. And she feels that like this is her calling and that like she is, she made a promise to God that she would like keep working on this reporting, and which is interesting because, you know, part of what's happening, part of the social licensing that's happening in Guyana is that both Exxon and the government now are hiring journalists away from their newspapers to work in their corporate communications departments.
Yikes.
And they have tried to hire Kiana twice now. And they, you know, they offer like a big salary and a free car and an amazing title and like all of this stuff, right?
Yep.
But she has this feeling of like, you know, I have a responsibility to my country and my fellow citizens, and B, you know, I made this commitment because she wanted to be a teacher, and when she tried to go be a teacher, they told her that she looked too young for the boys to take her seriously. I know. And so she like,
but thank goodness, right? Thank goodness. Because it
worked out well for all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So she prayed and, you know, sort of asked for a job that would still allow her to read and write. And the next day she got an interview for this job at the newspaper, and, you know, sort of away she went. So yeah, she's amazing. So yeah, we started out having her doing some interviews for us on the ground because it was COVID and we couldn't travel, and we kept planning stuff, and then it would get canceled because there would be a new wave or whatever.
Right.
You know? So we were working with her back and forth the whole time. And then when we went to Guyana, my producer and I, like, we spent several hours with Kiana over the course of, you know, several days. And I was like, I think she has to like be in it. Like, she's so compelling when she talks about the changes that she's seen and, you know, like everything that has been happening. Like, I want it to be in her voice, not like me describing it or whatever, you know? So,
right.
So anyway, then we had to kind of like shift gears a little bit, but yeah, she's been huge because we can ask her too, you know, we had her walk us through the sort of fraught political landscape in Guyana, which is very racialized and very complicated, you know, and we had her, like, there's been little things that I'll see in the news where I'm like, wait, why is this happening? And she can explain it. And I feel like that's really critical if you're coming from outside of the country to, you know, not just like swoop in and sort of like what a lot of journalists will do is like come in and ask someone for like contacts and information, and then that's it, you know?
Oh, okay. And not use their help.
Yeah. And also like not really credit them or pay them or like,
yikes.
you know.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to actually like work with someone who's on the ground and like who's from that place so that you're not, you know, stepping afoul of like certain cultural things too. Like there's a, it's a very different place from the US, and we wanted to make sure that, we weren't being thoughtless,
Yeah.
So yeah. So actually, like, she and Glenn, the publisher that we were talking about, they're the ones that like got me really thinking about the cricket team sponsorship. Because at our hotel the first day, I came downstairs in the lobby and there were all these cricket players wearing their uniforms, and it just said like Exxon across the front.
Oh no.
And I was like, wow, like that's really something, And so I was talking to them about it, and they were like, yeah, actually, like that was a really smart move on Exxon's behalf, because everyone in Guyana loves cricket. And before Exxon, they couldn't watch the games on TV. So that was a big deal. It was like people were like, thank God for Exxon. Now we can watch cricket on TV, and like, yeah. So anyway, just stuff like that, which you wouldn't think about, like an oil company, sponsoring the cricket team or whatever. But that's a big part of why they do sports sponsorships. It's actually like the number one thing that they spend ad money on is advertising in sporting events, and then like supporting teams and stadiums.
It's so funny that you say that, because I don't go to a lot of professional sports or whatever, but I don't know, I think it was last season, Ted Lasso, right? There's this airline. And
yes, that was such a great plot.
Wasn't that a great plot? I just was like, so it's the same thing, but it goes back to the social license thing.
Yeah.
Right. It's like,
that's right.
Because I was listening to your second episode on the contract right before I came in, and I heard the part about the cricket, and just that I was like, okay, yeah, that's just too much. Yeah. It's really, really creepy and super, super powerful to do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. It totally reminded me of that episode of Ted Lasso too, or that little arc.
That little arc. Yeah.
Oh, it was really,
So it's the part of that, speaking of the bigger arc or the bigger narrative, as we were talking about Hollywood and what could change, is this sort of idea of debunking the idea that oil is bringing economic development and prosperity. And they're just coming in with the storyline, oh, we're helping everybody.
We're just saving the poor.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is such an interesting and like entrenched framing, where it's basically, so like, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, it was like the fossil fuel industry would, like, every time they would talk about international climate negotiations, right? They would say, this is not fair because the US is being asked to do all these emissions cuts, but like all these other countries don't have to, and that's not fair.
Right.
That was the messaging that they used to block the Kyoto Protocol, for example, and all that. Now, the US doesn't want oil anymore, or whatever, is supposedly trying to get off of oil. The global North is trying to transition off of fossil fuels. And so now it's that it would be unfair to not allow the global South to have fossil fuels for longer. So they've completely switched their tune, because now they need those countries not just to develop oil and gas, but to get hooked on it, to use it. So it's really interesting. So now the story is, you can't put solving the climate crisis above solving energy poverty. The energy poverty issue is more urgent. And by that, they just mean, access to regular energy, regular access to energy. So consistent access to affordable energy. Where the debunking part comes in is, like I pointed out about Nigeria before, there aren't a lot of examples of, starting a fossil fuel industry actually solving the energy poverty issue, including in our own country, by the way. There are still people whose electricity bills are getting shut off in oil and gas states in the US. So if proximity to oil and gas development was what dictated your access to or affordability of energy, then I think things would look very different in most countries in the world. And then the economics data doesn't back it up either. So they make the argument all the time that, access to fossil fuels improves quality of life, extends lifespan, all of these things. And actually, there's peer-reviewed economic studies that have disproven that for the last decade plus, that have shown that actually, yes, there's a certain level of energy that's needed to deliver, a certain quality of life and a certain lifespan. But A, it doesn't have to be fossil fuel energy. And B, there's diminishing returns on that. So, once you hit like what you need to cover the basics, more energy does not improve your quality of life or your lifespan or your health or any of those things.
Right.
So anyway, yeah, it's a very compelling narrative. It's not just for, business people and, the fossil fuel industry, but I think the climate movement too has been very quick to say, oh yeah, you're right. Like, as part of a just transition,
oh, interesting,
we need to let these countries, develop fossil fuels for longer.
Yeah.
And actually, it's been interesting to talk to some of the organizers in those countries who are like, actually, we see that as another form of racism, colonialism, whatever, because what you're saying is dump the stuff nobody wants anymore on us while you guys transition to a better, cleaner energy situation with less air pollution.
And they're going to get their full due of years and years and years of this. It's like, no, you learn this. We can skip this down here in Global South.
Exactly. So there are quite a few people that are fighting against pipelines and against more fossil fuel development in Global South countries who would like to see, either a transition to renewables or in some cases hydro, in some cases nuclear. Like there is,
something other than fossil fuels. Yeah.
But they're like, why are you forcing us to get hooked on this thing that everybody says is going to be worthless in 10 years? That's the other thing too, is like oil companies have been worrying about what they call stranded assets for a long time, which are like, oil reserves that they have a claim to that they're not going to be able to tap and sell before, nobody wants it anymore. Right. This is part of why I think that they're front loading expenses in Guyana, because they want to make the most money while oil is still relatively high. And before, like half of those reserves in Guyana may end up being a stranded asset. We don't know yet. And if they are, then it will be Guyana that inherits that problem, not Exxon. And that's true of all these other countries too.
What's so interesting about what you said about the Exxon and the fossil fuel companies knew, and they were doing this global north thing, and then they saw the writing on the wall and switched their narrative. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is why is no one on the positive side or that knows what to do thinking that long term in that arc and going, what's going to happen?
Yes.
These companies are going to start doing this narrative in Global South. We should be ready.
That's right.
It wasn't like we couldn't see that coming, right?
Exactly. I think we certainly should have been able to see it coming because I think, it's quite predictable. And especially, like I said, once, you saw, especially after people saw what happened with tobacco, I think like the light bulb should have gone off for a lot of folks that like, oh, that's what the fossil fuel companies are going to do as well, And like I said, they're doing it with plastic too, where they're ramping up plastic production, even though nobody wants it. And they're trying to spur more demand for plastic in Africa and other Global South areas. And then they're going to be like, it's not our fault. All these countries in Africa just love plastic.
They're demanding it. Right.
We're just supplying a demand.
But then it goes to your work. I mean, the bigger picture of climate media, how.
Yeah.
So it's like you're unearthing these and you're sort of talking about this and really pointing it out and being loud. Right.
Yeah.
And then I know there's this whole organization called Covering Climate, trying to do a better job of it and all of that. It's just like, is Covering Climate educating people fast enough, or what do you see the climate media kind of their role and are they going to get on it pretty soon to the degree that we need them to?
Yeah, I do think that, I think the media has a huge role to play. The media has played a huge role in delaying climate action. And I think that it needs to acknowledge that and really like focus on doing, playing a role in climate action now.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, the media has been used as a tool by various companies for a really long time. And there are still some very entrenched ideas around, you know, if I'm going to quote a climate scientist, I also need to quote an oil CEO or, you know, whatever, so that nobody thinks I'm like an activist or biased or whatever. And like, look, you know, when we report on stuff, I always go to Exxon or Shell or Chevron or whoever it is and make sure that we do really thorough fact checking. We give them an opportunity to comment. I just this morning have been going back and forth with a spokesperson from Exxon about, you know, something that she had a problem with in one of the drilled episodes, which is always, you know, it's a little like interesting. But like, I'm not like, oh, you shouldn't even talk to those companies. I just think that like you need to evaluate what they're saying through the lens of, you know, what are they trying to achieve by having this conversation with me? What do they want to be getting out to the public? And like, does the actual data that I can gather from various sources back up what they're saying or not? Like, is it just their opinion or is it fact? And like, that's our job as journalists. And I think that like, there is starting to be some movement where I think journalists more and more are viewing these companies with like a healthy bit of skepticism. But unfortunately, we're also at a time when the business model for media is totally failing. You know, I mean, like there's just this morning, I was reading about the Texas Observer being shut
I saw
down.
that. Yeah.
We're losing outlets. NPR just laid off 10% of its staff, right? So I think that, yeah, it's there again, though. Actually, I think similar to what I was saying about the Hollywood stuff, I think that more than having like a team of climate reporters or, you know, a whole climate desk or whatever, I think it would be really good to have like a really high level climate editor that's helping to provide that lens on all of the stories, because that's really what's happening. It's like almost every story has some kind of a climate angle to it. And we should be like working those angles in where it makes sense. I mean, you don't have to shoehorn it into everything, but you don't have to for the most part. Like it's like pretty obvious layer that's there. In most stories.
I think you just came up with a new career that is needed, that maybe there could be majors in all sorts of gigantic universities. The climate editor, the person that gives context to anything, and that could be Hollywood. It could be corporations, right? It could be all these sectors. They all need an editor, which is they need some smart person who's watching the overall thing, right? The context and the history, and can pull their networks and be like, you know what? I'm not sure of this, but I know exactly who to call and whatever.
Exactly.
I think you're onto something. I think we need a whole new career. I think the climate editor is the thing. And I feel like journalists, you know, you all could have somebody that you can more easily do that with, as could I, and anything I'm reporting on or talking about. I think our job is done here with this podcast, because
we did it.
Coming up with that was great. So a couple more things, because I would be remiss, since the podcast is Living Change. One of the things I'm wondering is, tell me a little bit about your pivot point personally, like how any behavior change where you were like, oh my goodness, I need to start doing this. Any sort of behavior change or living change examples that you can tell me about in your life?
Yes. I really like this question, because I feel like there's this kind of false dichotomy in the climate space a lot about like individual action versus systemic change. And it's like, no, we need all of it. Like, individual action is how you drive towards systemic change for the most part. Also, most of us are part of the like global top 10%, which the IPCC just said, like, you know, we're responsible for like half of the world's emissions. Right. Which means that our habits do actually make a difference. And I'm not suggesting that anyone should beat themselves up and say, oh, I can't hold Exxon accountable because I haven't stopped using straws or whatever it is, you know, at all. But I do think it's important for people to kind of like, you know, take ownership. So anyway, for me, the things I always like to focus on are non-consumption things, because I feel like a lot of times this question becomes like, how are you buying different things?
Oh, yes.
Or like,
I like it.
how are, so I'm like, oh.
And then it sounds kind of really judgy, like just right away.
It sounds really judgy. And it also reduces people's individual power to purchasing power and not like political power or organizing power or community power or, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So for me, there's a bunch of things like I try to walk everywhere I can, if I can. And including like, even if it's going to take me 2 hours, I'm like, I'll just walk,
That's living change for sure. Yes.
I love it. And, but I also am really big on like, on having a lot of conversations with people in different communities. About,
Thank you for saying that.
What's going on? What could we be doing? Like, and in a non-judgy way.
In a casual.
Yeah. I feel like people need to have the space to be like, I don't really understand why XYZ, or, well, I heard that actually, climate's not that bad. And, maybe we don't need to make really urgent changes or whatever it is. Like, I think, or I'm really freaked out about it and I like can't have a conversation without freaking out, that's all of that is really, really valid. And I think it's helpful for people to be able to just like have a conversation about it where it's not so high stakes. So that is something that I like make a point of doing a lot with people. And then I also think I'm not like, oh, make sure you vote, because I know that, there are a lot of reasons why people feel like their vote is watered down or doesn't matter as much or whatever. And I understand why that is. But I also think that especially at the local level, there are a lot of ways to become civically engaged.
Yes.
And like finding out, what's really going on in your region, who's like, I live in Costa Rica now, but I was living in Tahoe in California, which like is this very beautiful place. There's like mountains and a lake and, it's lovely. And I think most of the people there had no idea that the guy who was our congressional rep was like a really like pro-logging, climate denying, like pro fossil fuels guy, and so there were a lot of efforts underfoot there to try to just make people aware of that, to be like, hey, because for a long time, I think pre-Trump, especially, Americans were really tuned out to what was happening in local and state politics. Yes, national too, but like, sometimes it can feel like you're actually having more of an impact when you're working at like the county level or the city level. And in a big way right now, cities and counties actually have quite a bit of power. They can set like, certain laws.
Yeah.
They can hire private law firms to file lawsuits. All the big climate cases right now are filed on behalf of cities and counties.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad you're saying this, because half of the people I've interviewed for season 1 are local leaders, right? So Alex Fish from Culver City, why did he ride a bike for transportation? Bowen Ma of North Vancouver, like why does she? All of these people that I've interviewed ride a bike for transportation, or very specifically less car, et cetera, and making changes in bus lanes, and the influence that they have. And then I will say, to your point, by having influence and by being seen riding a bike or whatever themselves, then it's pushing out. So it's almost like your conversations, your vote, you're mentioning it, reverberates hugely. And I think people don't understand that they actually do have influence if they mention, I rode my bike here, or I'm voting for this guy.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Totally. Huge influence. And actually there's a lot of research too that shows that if you are a public figure of any kind talking about climate, that it is actually really important for you to be like
seen,
living those beliefs too, like that, because actually like the hypocrisy there gets really
evident.
Amplified.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the whole reason that I'm doing these interviews. So thank you. I am so glad that this worked out for us to talk, Amy. Thank you so much for your time. I'm super excited about Light, Sweet, Crude. I hope everyone listens to it, because it just raises these issues up, and we'll start to think differently. We'll read the news differently. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was so fun to talk.
Yes, I'm so glad we finally got to talk in real life, or close to.
Yeah. Maybe we'll see each other somewhere along the way, but I'm happy to help amplify this, and just I'll see you on Twitter.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Clearly, one discussion does not do Amy's wisdom and expertise justice, nor does it come anywhere close to covering all that light, sweet crude includes. But listening to that kind of makes you want to learn more, right? Head on over to the Drilled podcast feed to hear the whole thing. And what a huge pleasure to chat with a climate media leader I've been following for years. Amy is truly a force of nature, and I know her reporting will energize you along your path to climate influence. Living Change is produced by Large Media. That's LARJ Media. Until next time, paddle safely.